I'm Rob Trasinski. This is Symposium, where we bring people together to have conversations about the nature of liberalism and a free society. My guest today is Sam Hammond, who is Director of Poverty and Welfare Policy at the Niskanen Center. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so the reason I'm having you on is you've made I thought it was a very interesting argument recently about the free market welfare state, and it's something that's sort of outside some of the traditional things that we think of as the left versus right political spectrum. So first, why don't you just to sort of encapsulate for us that argument for a free market welfare state as the optimal political and economic system?
Right. So, tracing my own thinking, I came from a traditional libertarian background. But one of the things I sort of realized was, classical liberalism was born in a pre-industrial age. The ideas that it came up with were spectacular for the time. But like any philosophy or any political philosophy has to evolve with the technological circumstances. And what the industrial age brought was a much higher degree of specialization, a much higher degree of labor mobility, a lot of new risks, right? Risks that didn't used to exist in an agrarian economy. So if you were, in 1700s England, you could lose, if you had a blight, if the seasons weren't in your favor, you could, you were exposed to that sort of risk. But that was risk that was broadly felt. Once we moved into a modern technological age, risks became more idiosyncratic. And my argument is that the emergence of the welfare state as we understand it, beginning in England with the old age pension acts and so forth, was actually a natural extension of the core liberal idea of positive sum games. So this is a different way of looking at what the welfare state is for. On the left, they take a more purely redistributive view of the welfare state. It's about taking from Peter to pay Paul. Whereas I think if you actually try to reconstruct the purpose of the welfare state, you realize that it's really these broad-based social insurance arrangements that try to pool risk across the population. And like any form of insurance that follows a different logic, it follows a logic of positive sum games, where it's rather than being a win-lose redistribution, it's a win-win arrangement where by pooling risks, you establish greater certainty over the future. And while at any point in time, someone is redistributing from the lucky to the unlucky, the point is not the redistribution. It'd be similar to thinking that fire insurance was a redistribution from people whose houses didn't burn down to people whose house did burn down. But that's the wrong way to look at it. Ex ante, everyone benefits from having fire insurance because of the certainty that it provides. And similarly with programs like unemployment insurance and old age Social Security, they instill a common logic of positive sum games. And so in the free market welfare state, I tried to flesh that out and prescribe what a research and reform agenda would look like, taking into account the potential complementarity between social insurance and a dynamic market economy.
Well, so what I want you to talk about, though, is the free market end of that free market welfare state, because as I understand it, your argument is that you need the social insurance aspects to sort of smooth out the risks and smooth out the creative destruction of a market economy so that you can continue to have a market economy and all the benefits of a market economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this has roots with the original classical liberals. So, Adam Smith was famously opposed to the settlement acts. The settlement laws were laws that said, if you fell on hard times, you had to return to your home, to your original settlement to receive aid. Mm-hmm. And Adam Smith realized that this was incredibly detrimental to labor mobility. Actually, a lot of Adam Smith's critiques of the guild system was really drawn from the same insight that these guilds did provide a level of economic security, but they also caused the economy to be sclerotic. There's a similar lesson for broad-based social insurance programs where they allow the economy to actually undergo creative destruction, where from the point of view of the individual, that people don't want job protection per se. What they want is income security and employment security. Whether it's working at a particular job ends up becoming a proxy if you don't have great safety nets. So, the example I give in my paper is in Denmark, and part of the reason why Denmark has such a expansive social insurance system while also ranking very highly in terms of economic freedom, is because it's a small open economy, and for that reason, it's sort of by nature open to the trade winds, and literally the trade winds because they export turbines and stuff like that. But what that means is, they don't have a choice. If the trade winds shift and a part of their export sector loses a lot of its demand, those people have to be moved into new lines of work. Now, the alternative is to erect protections and say, we're going to protect this industry. But that's, again, focusing on the job rather than the economic security. And I think one of the insights of, going back to the new liberals in the UK, was this realization that you can actually make the economy more dynamic by abstracting away the form of economic security that employment provides, and the forms of safety nets that used to be instantiated through guilds and the like, and say, actually, we're going to provide a baseline level of employment security and do something that's maybe bigger on the fiscal side, but more liberal on the regulatory side. And one of the, I take a very comparative approach rather than sort of this more ideal theory approach where we try to dream up what the utopia is. I try to look around the world, and when you actually do a chart of OECD countries by how much they spend on social transfers against the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, there's a strong positive correlation. So economies that have larger income supports and direct transfers end up ranking higher in terms of economic freedom. And people might think of this, people traditionally thought of this as sort of a paradox or an oxymoron. Even when people talk about like Hayek's support for social insurance, they think of it as sort of a deviation or an exception that he's making. Whereas I think it actually derives from a very common, kind of Hayekian insight of the importance of planning at the individual level, and being able to plan for your future and having that certainty over time. So I kind of turn the usual political spectrum on its head, where we kind of think of left-right as running along a spectrum of being anti-government, and on the anti-government end, it's both anti-transfer and anti-regulation, and on the pro-government end, it's both pro-transfer and pro-regulation. And what I suggest is that actually these regulatory and social insurance approaches to economic security are in some senses substitutes. And if you don't have the social insurance, the political economy of a democracy will agitate for a more regulatory approach. And so in equilibrium, what you end up seeing are countries that have robust forms of social insurance and very free markets. And then the kind of Greece-Italy case where they have very de minimis spending programs in terms of social insurance, but everyone gets a public sector job, and your mom's your family cafe never shuts down, and so that does provide a kind of economic security if the regulations are such that your business will never close down and that you have a clientelistic relationship to the state. That does provide economic security, but also the economy of Italy has actually shrunk over the last 20 years.
Right. So, the thing I find fascinating this, that you just mentioned Denmark, and you also talk about Sweden as an example of this. And, you're talking about the actual Swedish model and not what a lot of people imagine the Swedish model to be.
Right. Yeah. Actually, this is another Hayekian thing. I believe in the Constitutional Liberty, Hayek contrasts Sweden and Great Britain at the time. And at the time, Great Britain was nationalizing the railroads and they have the National Health Service, which is a fully state-run healthcare system. And what Hayek remarks is that actually, Sweden with their universal pensions, but privatized. Well, now they have privatized schools. Back then they had. Sweden was actually founded. Built their original economy off of a totally privatized forestry system. So Sweden has a long history of very laissez-faire economics, but they've also had what the political scientist Bo Rothstein has described as people's insurance. So they conceptualize their welfare state as providing insurance for everybody. And in the Constitution of Liberty, Hayek points out that, on some level, Sweden is spending more money, but at least according to his definition at the time, the United Kingdom was much more socialistic because they were actually trying to plan the economy, control national champions and the like. And I think this is a routine source of confusion. You see this even today where, Bernie Sanders will say, I just want us to be more like Denmark. And then there will be like 3 articles in National Review saying, well, you don't understand Denmark as well as you think, Mr. Sanders. But then that dialectic never sort of resolves itself to realize, there are certain political economic forces here that are unavoidable. And if you are going to resist instantiating a Danish style social security system or Swedish style social insurance system, you don't have to go all the way. But you need some of those basic infrastructure in place, or else you're going to get demands for protectionism, for occupational licensing regulations, for a new guild system, for employment laws that make it very difficult to hire and fire. And that's a path that, I think we started to go down with the Trump administration, where there really was this deep source of grievance deriving from people who perceive themselves to be the losers from free trade of China and the broader sort of shift in technology. And those people, there's a degree to which those democratic demands are inchoate, and they can be translated to different solutions. And Trump presented one set of solutions, which was high tariffs and slashing Medicaid and other programs. And I think that the correct approach is actually the exact inverse of that, to embrace open, dynamic market economies, but recognizing that they need to be buttressed with continuous investments in human capital, and also the social insurance systems that help put a floor beneath workers and recycle the labor when there is creative destruction.
Yeah. I don't want to talk much about Trump, but my impression is he wasn't really so much for slashing the existing welfare state as for supplementing it with some kind of form of industrial policy. Now, he never got around to actually making all the industrial policy deals that he said he was going to, but the idea of having more regulation over international trade, especially, what was
right.
essential.
So this is it's going back to the dichotomy between insurance versus central planning. And they're not perfect substitutes, but if you're so dogmatically opposed to spending money, say on boosting unemployment insurance, boosting active labor market programs, boosting vocational apprenticeship training, boosting programs to help people relocate, if you resist those, then you're going to gravitate towards more what I think of as being more directly interventionist paradigms.
Right. So, while we were talking about Denmark and Sweden, one thing I want to also mention, though, is the contrast to today's left, to sort of the Bernie Sanders left. He's always saying, "Oh, I just want to be like Denmark," but Denmark and Sweden actually have a number of policies that would be considered almost radical right-wing in the U.S. Things like school vouchers, and I think Sweden did a sort of semi-privatization of its social security system. And there are ways in which their welfare state or their social insurance schemes differ from a lot of, for example, here under the Biden administration, one of the things they're talking about is the PRO Act, which is sort of California's AB 5, on a national scale, and the idea of let's regulate the labor market and force everybody into unions because unions are the way that will deliver, you know, these benefits. So there's a difference between what these sort of Scandinavian countries that you're talking about, what they've done, and what the left here is attempting to do as their solution to the problem.
Yeah, totally. You know, this the way I put it in the paper is to say that the mood does not match the territory, right? We have these certain alignments that follow mood affiliation, and the reality is actually completely perpendicular to that. And it's the same on the right and the left. So on the left, you know, there is this movement to double down on our existing enterprise level union model, and you know, even that misunderstands how you know, countries like Sweden and Denmark maintain very high rates of unionization, like 90% union penetration. But the difference is it's a totally different union model. They use sectoral bargaining that is premised on a cooperative arrangement between labor and management, rather than our very adversarial approach. And part of that cooperative bargain is actually to say, hey, in exchange for these, you know, robust unemployment benefits, let's say, we're going to require, you know, clear accountability and processes that promote labor productivity, right? And that's actually in the end how a country like Denmark can have, you know, McDonald's employees being paid $25 an hour. It's because they reward labor productivity and performance, right? And part of I have a whole different article on this in the context of the UAW and the old Saturn Corporation. I don't know if you remember that, but
I remember Saturn.
You know, yeah, Saturn Corporation was this innovative employee-owned car company, and part of the bargain was because it's employee-owned, the workers on the shop floor would get a profit share, but in exchange they had very intense, you know, productivity and accountability guidelines. They had to meet performance targets. They were continuously innovating on process, and as a result, they made an amazing product and was a quick, you know, fast-growing company. And the UAW attempted to unionize them like 3 or 4 times, and every single time they rejected them, until finally General Motors bought the company out and then shut it down, seemingly at the UAW's behest. So, you know, there is this. This is another area where our language sort of gets in the way, because there isn't just one union model. You look at Denmark or Sweden and you superficially think, oh, well, they're doing fantastic because of all the unions. But it's a union model that's premised on a very different kind of social compact between business and labor, a compact that is, again, premised on a kind of win-win, positive-sum relationship rather than a purely zero-sum adversarial one.
No, that's fascinating to me, because I think there's a real question as to why we can't do that. So for example, I mean, I kind of think of this, you know, I read your piece about how this political spectrum of we'd have free market welfare state. I think if you put that up for a vote to most people, you know, you get extremely wide agreement. And if you looked at it from that perspective, you know, we ought to be in the era of good feelings, right? An era of everybody being pretty much agreement, having a broad social consensus in favor of this. I think if you ask most people if that's the way they want the economy and our political system to be run, they would agree with it. Now, I'm one of the few outliers who's going to be a critic of the welfare state. I'll get to that in a few minutes. But I think you have a very broad agreement, and yet we're fighting like cats and dogs all the time. And I think it's kind of interesting to ask, why is it that happens, and you attribute it to mood, but I think it also has to do with, well, let's let me get your view on it first, and then I'm going to come back to some questions on that.
Yeah, you know, I think liberalism is always a kind of minority point of view, because we are kind of the brokers between conflicting worldviews. And you know, the Danish model, which again, we're using it as an archetype. But it actually literally arises from a kind of tripartite negotiation between labor and capital, where capital wants at-will employment, the ability to hire and fire, They want productivity standards and accountability. And labor wants, robust economic security through, strong unemployment programs. And they meet at the table and they both get a piece of what they want. We don't have anything like that in the US political system, where those conflicting interests can arrive at a sort of mutually agreeable outcome. Instead, we have kind of a whiplash where one fully formed vision on the right will take power for a bit, and one fully formed vision on the left will take power for a bit. And yes, sometimes the left comes in and they pass like big expansions to unemployment insurance, which I favor. But they also then try to pass things like the PRO Act, or they try to tax Amazon. And then conversely, when the right comes in, they do things that I like. They're more on the deregulatory side, but then they also try to like add work requirements to Medicaid and stuff like that. And really, what we need is a different political economy where we can have the right be as deregulatory as it can be, and we can have the left promote robust social insurance and excise the bad parts on both ends.
Yeah. So in your paper, though, you refer to this often as being political moods that sort of align people, at right angles to what you think that the way we should think of the political spectrum, where it goes from, sort of authoritarian populism to a liberal welfare state, and instead we're going at small government and big government, sort of socialism on one side and libertarianism on the other. By the way, I'm not really sure that that's actually the political spectrum we have in this country. Sometimes I think, especially now, that our political spectrum is all on sort of the left side of your spectrum, which is socialism on one side and authoritarian populism on the other. And as someone who's more on the libertarian end of the spectrum, I don't feel like like the political parties have me as any political party has me as their final endpoint. But what I would say is that you described it as sort of moods that have political moods that cause people to put things together that don't necessarily go together. So, you hate government management of the economy, so you also hate the welfare state and transfer programs. And you're arguing basically that those two things shouldn't go together. Those should be on different axes. But I think it's not so much a mood. I think you have to take into account that it's a philosophy behind it. So, people on the left, especially the people on the very far left, advocate a welfare state not because they think, oh, we need social insurance to smooth out the bumps of capitalism, but because they think capitalism is an inherently exploitative system, right? So they have an anti-capitalist ideology. Now, in the far left, we're talking about people who are Marxists, but in the moderate left, you get people who are influenced by that perspective, that they view capitalism as an inherently predatory and unjust. And so they come from a viewpoint that puts these things together because there is a philosophical worldview behind it. And similarly, I would say for those of us who are on the libertarian or anti-government end of the spectrum, we put those things together because we view the independence of the individual in all different respects as being the goal. So that's a philosophical outlook. So just to put this in more concrete terms, so you could respond to it, is you sort of had this mapping out the mostly European and North American countries on this graph of sort of the authoritarian populist versus the free market welfare state. And the US is this sort of outlier down here in the more libertarian quadrant, with less regulation of the economy, less central planning of the economy, but also a somewhat smaller welfare state. And I think to some extent, though, that represents a choice for a more individualist approach to organizing our society.
Well, I'm not quite sure of that. I think, there is, ex post facto rationalizations that people make. There is a coherent environmental ideology, for example, that tries to lump together land conservation, anti-littering, let's ban single-use plastics, but also the biggest problem is climate change, right? And I think of those as, again, something you can separate, where you could really be really concerned about climate change because global warming is sort of this, potentially catastrophic phenomena, but not care at all about, nature preserves. But there is, I think, people get attracted to environmentalism because they sort of have a pre-existing mood that attracts them to, that makes them sort of pro-environment in a vague sense, and then they build an ideology out of it ex post. And I do think there is, in my experience, similar things that happen across both left and right political ideologies, where, particularly on the libertarian right, there is a strong, anti-authoritarian streak that then I think finds the philosophical scaffolding to attach to after. Now, we can agree to disagree a little bit on maybe that causality, but I do think that modern American libertarianism, of the sort of Rothbardian kind, is an extremely modern ideology. It's not. It's new. Let's put it that way. But I also don't think it's really that internally coherent. You can take a very propertarian view, for instance. But when you drill down into what that view actually states, it really is more a kind of more moral error theory. It's basically saying we can't make any judgments, so we're just to build this up out of a kind of Lockean, minimalist theory of property rights. So in many ways, a more robust social insurance system is empowering to the individual, precisely because it enables people to plan for the future. I think, we see this with the pandemic in a really big way, where suddenly it was realized that, having funded unemployment insurance programs, UI wasn't just a, welfare program for the indigent, but actually something that was crucial for people in the middle class who experienced unexpected shock. And being able to plan for those unexpected shocks is really crucial for your ability to live out your individual conception of the good life. So I don't think they're actually, I don't think they're in tension with individualism. I think it's actually, they're complementary. But I do think this is a kind of insight that people struggle to reach, because it does take a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B, at least how we normally think about these things. And so by nature, it's going to be a difficult thing for people to swallow, because especially libertarianism feels almost like this pristine, construct that is like an algebra. It's pure. And a lot of people I know from being libertarian for most of my life are definitely attracted to that purity. And so on a first order approximation, my approach is much more messy, because I'm trying to look out at the world and see how things actually exist. You mentioned the US being an outlier. It is an outlier in terms of income security programs, but one of the reasons why the US seems like it has a small welfare state is because we do so much of it subterranean, right? Mm-hmm. The biggest outlay, the biggest tax expenditure in the US federal government is for employer-sponsored health insurance. It's almost $300 billion a year, which is half the budget of Medicaid, right? So, I have very generous employee health benefits, like the Cadillac of Cadillac. I don't need it because I'm healthy and I'm only 29. But it feels like I earned that benefit, and it feels like it's mine, and I'm getting it as part of my compensation package. But in fact, those benefits are untaxed, and that represents a huge subsidy, a subsidy that in aggregate is about half the budget of Medicaid. But if we look at somebody on Medicaid, we think of that as, that's a person dependent on the government, whereas my dependency has just been hidden within the tax code. So, I think part of the reason why we have gone down that approach of hiding lots of these middle class welfare programs beneath the surface is attain that small government mythos. And I think we're sort of running on fumes now. A lot of people lost their jobs during the pandemic, and when they lost their jobs, they also lost their health insurance. And we start to realize, well, maybe having healthcare through your employer is not the best way of doing this.
Well, the healthcare through the employer was a differential tax treatment that was actually made to try to, again, to create this idea of a welfare state benefit distributed through corporations, and that's sort of a preferred way of doing it. But on the other hand, the fact that so much of these benefits are going to the middle class does create, I think, an interesting question, because you mentioned in your piece, you have a quick reference to Wagner's law, which is a sort of a paradoxical thing, which is that basically as countries become wealthy, they tend to then add on large welfare states after they become wealthy. The wealthier a country becomes, the more it feels it can afford a welfare state and adds on lots of benefits. And that creates, in my mind, a kind of paradox in that, you have the largest benefits in the world going to the wealthiest people in the world. You're in America, in Denmark, in Northern Europe, you have the wealthiest people in the world and the wealthiest people in all of human history. And yet they're getting the most benefits from the state. And you would think these would be people who would need it the least. And in a way, that paradox is summed up in the fact that, outside the US. So in the US, we tend to have the idea we're going to have welfare programs and we're not going to pay for them. We're just going to borrow $1 trillion every year. But in the welfare states in Northern Europe, what you tend to have is a system where there's very generous welfare payments, but there's also enormous taxes, and enormous taxes paid by everybody. So in a way, there's this weird paradox where everybody has lots of benefits, but it's being paid, it's really their own money being paid back to them. So when you have this, there's a sort of paradox there in the idea of a middle-class welfare state with prosperous people, the wealthiest people in the world, getting the highest benefits in the world, and it's really all just their own money coming back to them. And
right. Well, when you have insurance, it's your own premiums coming back to you. And I think this is part of one of the mental blocks is thinking of the welfare state as just nationalized charity. And I have a different paper called "It Still Takes a Nation" about why private charity can never replace the welfare state, precisely because it's not just charity. There is a component of the welfare state that is a kind of poor relief. And as you note, relative to the global south, the poor people in Denmark or America are not poor in a global sense. But that's not what the system is. That's really not what the system is there for. It's there to do nation level risk pooling. And on a first, that what that looks like is taking money from this, in aggregate, taking money from the same set of people and giving it right back to them. but it's not that the same people are paying as much into the system as they're getting out. It's that, similar to social security or Medicare, there's a level of reciprocity where take health insurance. The 5% of the population drives 50% of the healthcare spending, and that's because those are the most sick people. And you don't know ex ante if you're going to be one of those sick people. Maybe in the near future we'll have full genetic sequencing and we'll be able to tell with Calvinist certainty whether we're going to be get cancer early or die young or whatever. But in light of that uncertainty, health insurance provides an enormous benefit because you don't have to save millions of dollars for this exorbitant cancer treatment, right? That insurance always makes the most sense where the average is different from the variance, right? And when you look at where most of the spending is going, it is going towards pension programs, healthcare, and child benefits and unemployment insurance. And all those things, I think you can make an argument as being forms of social insurance, not forms of just pairwise transfers to poor people.
Well, so it's not so much pairwise transfers to poor people, but it's like transfers from the middle class back to the middle class. And my concern is it's not really necessarily treated as insurance. So for example, take Social Security in the US, where you pay 12.5% of your income roughly in Social Security taxes. And that money goes out and gets spent on existing, on people who are getting on people who are already in the system, who are already receiving benefits. And then you have sort of a vague promise that, well, maybe there'll be money left, 30 years from now that you'll get it. I'm skeptical as to whether that's going to happen. I think that the current numbers say basically it's going to run out of money about the time that I reach 65. And this is something that the Gen Xers have known basically since those of us who pay attention have known since we were young, is that the money's going to run out about the time we retire. But it's this system where if you said instead you can save that money in your own account and in your own savings and provide for yourself in retirement, you would actually probably be better off, and you would have a greater degree of sort of independence. And that's what I think is interesting about the Northern European sort of Scandinavian style of welfare state, is it's not just a sort of pragmatic judgment with regard to, oh, well, here's the best way to construct a social system. There's also an element of values and ideology in it, which is that they sort of value equality and everybody getting the same benefits from the state and everybody having things sort of smoothed out. They value that over the idea of independence from the government, which is something that we, as Americans, being more individualist, place a greater value on independence from the government.
Well, on the one hand, social insurance does operate by a different internal logic than commercial insurance. It operates based on the basis of need, right? So, in my It Still Takes a Nation paper, I sort of retrace the history of the friendly societies and the mutual aid societies, and try to make the case that, and you can think of the liberal welfare state as just the mutual aid society writ large. One of the reasons why mutual aid societies broke down was not crowd out or government regulation. It was actually competition from commercial insurance, because commercial insurance could swoop in and take this group of take this fraternal order that was sort of practicing a kind of proto form of social insurance and say, hey, we'll charge you much lower premiums because we know how to actually do actuarial science and face to risk. That led to the unraveling of these sort of naive insurance pools. And you can think of whether it's payroll taxes or whatever other means you use to finance social insurance, as reinstating that flat premium that everyone is paying the same amount no matter what. And conversely, that benefits are paid out on the basis of need. So that is sort of that follows a different logic. It follows it's a kind of analytical egalitarianism, not a egalitarianism of outcome. But in terms of like the sovereign individual, you're right. Social Security payroll taxes are compulsory, but so are all taxes. And actually, that's how you get the pooling equilibrium to reinstate. If you allowed people to pull out, you would again recreate that unraveling of the insurance pool, where people who know that they are going to die when they're 60 and don't need Social Security, why would they ever pay into the system, right? And so this, going back to the average versus the standard deviation or the variance, old age Social Security is a kind of collective annuity, and annuity markets are well known to suffer from market failure and adverse selection, because people who know that they're going to live a long time are going to buy lots of annuities. And this is why social insurance on a first blush is actually mildly regressive in its redistribution, because wealthy people tend to correlate with living longer. But this is actually the thing that it's insuring against. It's insuring against outliving your savings. So you might have your own nest egg, you might have your own life savings on which to retire, but you can't, if you know that the average age is 80, the average life expectancy is 80, but you know that there's a 20% chance you might die when you're 70 and a 20% chance you might die when you're 90, you can't save for that eventuality. You could save, if you save to live to 90, you're going to have way too much money if you end up dying at 80. And so it's addressing that risk and pooling that risk that old age Social Security is trying to provide for. But you do raise a good point about the fact that we have a pay-as-you-go system that historically has been underfunded. And I think it's worth observing that countries like Denmark, all their pensions are fully paid for. And I think there's a sort of quality of institutions that affects both the government and the market. So, in the recent COVID relief package that Biden passed, there was an $85 billion bailout to multi-employer pension funds with no strings attached. So the Teamster unions got their dream. I think that's grotesque. But I also think, going back to some of our points about labor unions and sort of the grand bargain you have to make, we're never going to get to Denmark if Democrats are afraid of disciplining their employer pension lobbies, because ultimately we want high functioning institutions, we want a high functioning market, and we want a high functioning government. And I think in some sense, the quality of both those sets of institutions derives from a common source. And the countries that have very robust, well-regulated markets also tend to have high functioning government. And I think, the US has a twin problem right now where we have a lot of kind of market corruption, the accretion of special interest favors and cronyism, at the same time as we have a relatively handicapped government, and one that's become increasingly captured. And I think, I think that's just a problem, right? Like, regardless of what policy we're talking about, if you can't implement it because the political process is so gunked up, then we're kind of doomed.
Well, and that's, I think, is a little bit of a problem with the approach you have, is that in a way you're making a political argument, not just an economic argument. There's the political argument is we have the disruptions created by capitalism that creates winners and losers, and in order to sort of appease or reassure the losers and be allowed and make it possible to have a freer economy, therefore we have to have these social insurance benefits. But that's sort of a political calculation, that this is the balance we have to create politically. And the problem is that I'm not sure American politics is really going to work that way. That sort of on the one hand, you're sort of treating people as well, I think it has to do with ignoring the ideological element of it. Because, for example, so my biggest concern when you talk about having some of these Scandinavian style social insurance programs, it's a little bit like, well, for example, the universal basic income. People have said we should have, there's an old libertarian argument that says we should have, instead of the welfare state, we should just have cash benefits, no strings attached. So instead of the government says, we'll provide you housing, and it'll be terrible, poor quality public housing, and it'll be in the Robert Taylor homes, whether or not you want to live there. The Robert Taylor homes, and that proved to be a horrible disaster, such that the Robert Taylor homes no longer even exist. They decided to tear them down eventually. But instead of doing that, we should just hand people cash. Well, the problem is, politically, I look at that and I think, well, you know what we're really more likely to end up with is universal basic income on top of all the existing welfare programs, instead of as a replacement for all the existing welfare programs. Or where people said, there was a big movement a while back to promote the idea of a national sales tax, and that would be way better than an income tax. And of course, we all know what would happen if you actually made the case for a national sales tax. We get the national sales tax on top of the income tax, instead of as a replacement for it. So, I mean, how do you propose sort of overcoming that political hurdle to the way you see things?
Well, I mean, in the abstract, I'm not a huge fan of UBI, again, because I think it conflates transfers with social insurance. Because your $10,000 a year is not going to cut it if you are on dialysis, right? But I do favor child allowances, for example, because I do think that they solve a genuine market failure of money following non-working dependents. And I did work on the Mitt Romney's Family Security Act, which is a kind of microcosm of the bargain you're talking about. And it was really important in our proposal that we don't just create a child allowance, but we also do it by consolidating and simplifying existing programs. And you're right, the left would prefer and has taken a purely additive approach.
Yeah,
but this goes to why, like, on a meta level, we're not going to get to tripartite bargaining or something like that. But the political process, the regular order in the U.S. is the root of a lot of these problems, where Congress is just not doing the job of Congress. And in principle, you could, the way it used to work is you had a dialectic where the left overreaches and the right comes back and trims the fat, and then conversely, the right overreaches and the left comes in and trims the fat. And that's what a healthy democracy should look like. It should have a left and a right that play off each other. And Biden will create the child allowance, and then Romney will cut the fat. But that regular order has broken down, and I honestly don't see how we break out of it, because this again goes to like a more fundamental problem, which is the corruption of U.S. institutions and the gridlock in Congress, and not just gridlock, but a kind of misdirection of attention. And so, there's no easy way out of that equilibrium. Lee Drepman calls it a doom loop. I think that we're probably going to sort of like Sweden had. Sweden had in the 70s had a very left-wing movement that didn't just have the kind of Hayekian welfare state of the Sweden in the 1940s, but tried to nationalize industry. They tried to literally take public ownership of the stock market, and there was a big backlash, and the economy crashed, and they went through a series of liberalizing reforms and came out stronger afterward. And if you'd much rather have a political system where you didn't have to have a crisis to fix the problems, but on the current trajectory, the U.S. has just been moving from one crisis to another.
Well, yeah, that's something I think a lot of people haven't appreciated, because my sort of political awakening as a teenager came from doing a class paper on socialism in Sweden, and the idea this is touted as a model society. And then at the time I was writing this, like circa 1984, everything was coming crashing down, and the whole system was in crisis. And I think that people still have, on left and the right, still have the idea of Sweden as being what it was in the 70s, and haven't taken on board the reforms that happened, after I looked at that. The reforms happened in the 90s, and where they reformed back to something a little more market oriented. And I think that's the problem. Part of the problem we have here is that I would find the welfare state less onerous if I thought it was more reformable, and you didn't get portrayed by any reform you suggested, you got portrayed as wanting to push grandma over the cliff in her wheelchair. If you remember that.
No, I hate that too. I mean, I work in poverty and welfare policy, and I make a point to never use those kind of arguments, because they don't have any limiting principle. They're just playing on emotions. But I am, my job, my day job is to be a policy entrepreneur. So I feel like you can step back and say, the system has a ton of inertia. It's like trying to steer a container ship or something like that. But on the other hand, I feel like I have a level of agency, and the world is, the Thomas Sowell quote, everything is trade-offs. I try to make the difference I can on the margin, and try to make the case honestly and openly to people on the center left and center right that, hey, there's a way we can synthesize both your concerns and have both sides leave the table happy, right? Now, it's an uphill battle, but part of the reason why the U.S. is in the state of disarray that it's in is actually a testament to our exorbitant privilege, our privilege, not just having the world's dominant economy, but very soft budget constraints, also just by dint of size, a lot of space for complacency, because even if we screw up regulation, countries are still going to want to found their company here because we got the biggest, most productive market. Now, I think that story of complacency, and one of the ways you can sort of think of this is that story of complacency has sort of run its course, and we're no longer the big closed economy that we used to be. Post Cold War, we've gradually become a lot like a small open economy, going back to my point about how, you know, Denmark has to have these programs because it's buffeted by trade winds. There's a famous paper, I forget the author, called something like why small countries are more right wing, and he uses New Zealand as an example. But one of the reasons why New Zealand ranks so highly, for example, in the freedom indices is because it's so small. They have no choice but to have a well-run, efficient market economy. Because they can't impose a wealth tax. All that money would leave in a hurry. And so, you know, there's a long list of reckonings that are still yet to happen in the U.S. context, and I don't think we'll arrive at anything like my optimum until those reckonings have been passed through. But it's the sort of thing where you have to go through. You can't avoid it.
Yeah, I think maybe some of the difference between our views, though, is I do tend to think that things will tend to go to their logical conclusions and logical extremes. That if you try to have a moderate welfare state, or, you know, that it will tend to become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's one of the reasons why I oppose going on that road in the first place. But what I do want to say is I really appreciate the way in which you've approached this, and the way in which the idea of reconceiving the traditional categories, thinking about things that are sort of orthogonal to the traditional left-right spectrum, and also discussing it in that way that it's not just, you know, anything different from the ideal welfare state is throwing grandma off the cliff. So I really appreciate, I think that sort of out of the box thinking is very much, or new thinking about how to look at our categories and how to look at what liberalism is very much needed, particularly at this moment in time. So I really want to thank you for coming on to share that.
Oh, and thanks for having me, Rob.
I'm Rob Trosinski with Symposium Magazine. For more conversations like this, follow our YouTube channel, follow our podcast, or go to Symposium Magazine at symposium.substack.com. Thank you for joining the conversation.